You're listening to a podcast by the Perennial Leader Project. To learn more, visit perennial.substack.com. In this episode of In Search of Wisdom, my guest is Dr. Daniel McInerny, author of the new book, Beauty and Imitation. Dr. McInerny is an associate professor and chair of the philosophy department at Christendom College, as well as a novelist and dramatist. In the conversation today, we discuss the wisdom of imitation, the art of contemplation, the way of beauty, and much more. I really enjoyed this one and hope you do as well. Without any further delay, please welcome the wise and gracious Dr. Daniel McInerny. Daniel, welcome to In Search of Wisdom.
Thank you, Joshua. It's just a pleasure to be with you here today.
Well, I'm so glad to have you. As I mentioned before we hit record, I've been excited for your book to come out, which is going to be the topic of our conversation, Beauty and Imitation. And to get us started, I wanted to share with the listeners what Peter Kreeft said about your book. Quote, "This is literally the best book on beauty that I have ever read." And the praise goes on, but I'm just curious to ask, what's it like to get that type of praise for this book that you put out into the world?
Well, it's very humbling. It would be humbling to hear that from anybody. It's especially humbling to hear that from Dr. Kreeft, who's just a magisterial presence in the world of philosophy. So it's very flattering, very humbling, very gratifying. One cannot help but feel it's a little, maybe more than a little over the top. But I don't say that to take away a jot of my appreciation for what Peter Kreeft said about the book.
Well, I'm glad you put it out in the world, and I'm not all the way through it, but loving what I've read thus far. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the title, Beauty and Imitation. I want to say I remember maybe hearing a number of months back, maybe a working title, The Way of Beauty. So talk to us about Beauty and Imitation, if you could.
Yeah, the book is a philosophical reflection on the arts. And the approach that I take to the arts is by way of imitation, which is a way of understanding the arts that goes all the way back to the ancient Greece. That what the arts do is they, in some sense, imitate, represent reality to us in a way that is delightful. So imitation is at the very heart of my approach to the arts. But what we are imitating, yes, we're imitating reality when we make works of art, but we're imitating it under the aspect of its beauty.
Nice. And before we get too into it, we generally try to define terms and things like that. And I'm curious to ask in the way of art. Maybe it can be a difficult thing to say, what is art? But I would love it if you would also maybe bring it into modern life. What types of things, in our modern culture would you say fall into the category of art?
Yeah. Well, one big distinction we should make in talking about the word art is we should distinguish between what the Greeks, I'm thinking especially of Aristotle here, called the useful arts, and distinguish those from what I call in the book following Aristotle, the mimetic arts. So in talking about the arts in my book, I am not so much interested in arts such as the iPhone that I'm using to join you in this conversation, or my fan that's across the room, or my spoons in my silverware drawer. Very useful sorts of art. I'm interested in the art that again represents, in some way imitates reality. And again, I call that batch of arts the mimetic arts. Sometimes, maybe we most often refer to those as the fine arts. I choose not to use that term because it's associated with a way of thinking about the arts that's really in many ways antithetical to the Aristotelian tradition that I'm following in my book. But in any event, I'm talking about all the arts that we're familiar with. Music, painting, dance, film, fiction in all its forms, stage drama, etc. Those are the mimetic arts. Those are the arts that imitate. And if we're going to go a step deeper into this concept of imitation, we want to start by saying that what it means to imitate is to make a picture of something. This is a way of approaching the arts that I take from my great teacher, Monsignor Robert Sokolowski, who develops an understanding of imagery and art as a kind of picturing. So even when we talk about a mimetic art that's not a literal picturing. So even when we're not talking about painting or drawing and we're talking about dance or music, I'm inviting the reader to still think about those as kinds of picturing. We are trying to capture reality in a picture.
But as a follow up, I wanted to, ask a question that you write in the book, which, what does it mean to think about art philosophically? And maybe in addition to that, I'm also thinking about some of the listeners, this being a podcast in search of wisdom, the good life type of stuff. How do we connect the dots? How does thinking about art philosophically connect with like the art of living, if you will?
Wonderful, wonderful. I love that question because that's the question that motivates me as a philosopher. I'm not just trying to think of an answer to some abstruse scholarly question, but I'm trying to think about how we live and the best way to live. So to approach your question, I'm going to use the example I use in the book when I'm talking about this, and that is watching a movie at home. So I invite the audience to think of that very familiar situation. You're at home, maybe you're in the theater, and you're hunkered down strangely in the dark, often enough, or at least with lights dim. And very oddly, you're watching flickering images of what? Of human beings doing things. And it could be Tom Cruise trying to hang on to the side of an airplane as it takes off, or it could be, a much kind of subtler and quieter image of Hamlet thinking about to be or not to be. But we're watching images of ourselves. Armadillos don't do this. The cows in the farm across the street from my house, they don't gather on a Saturday night to watch pictures of cows. But we human beings do that. Not often enough do we reflect on the strangeness and the mysteriousness of that activity. That we spend a lot of time with pictures, images of ourselves. And so to think philosophically about art, in this case, the art of the cinema, of film, is to kind of swing away, as it were, from your position on the couch in front of the flat screen, or in other words, to hover above your position on the couch and reflect on what you're doing and ask yourself questions like, why do I do this as a human being? What is the point of it? Why don't the lower animals do this? Or if sometimes we see chimpanzees kind of making what look to be drawings. Are they actually trying to make mimetic art? All of those sorts of questions are philosophical questions. They're not questions that we ask ourselves in our common, ordinary attitude toward life. They are reflective questions where we're standing back, we've swung away, we're hovering above our normal activity, trying to make sense out of it.
I'm curious how you think about when it comes to imitation, this mimetic. Many of the listeners are probably familiar with Rene Girard, this mimetic desire as not a good thing. Like we imitate, but not always in a good way. In a recent episode I've been doing with a friend on the Character Lab, one episode we did was on role models. This idea of following the lives of others that shows up in so many different traditions. How do you think about using that thing of imitation in a good way, this thing that we do, towards the capital G good, I guess, if you will?
Beautiful question. Yeah, the thought of Rene Girard, which is extraordinarily valuable, is really out there in our culture now in a way that is uh, one might not expect because his thought is rather difficult. Um, and I appreciate what I understand of it, but I situate his account of mimetic desire within an Aristotelian understanding of our mimetic impulse. So, in his little work, The Poetics, which is hardly more than a pamphlet, but a beautiful work that has had a tremendous influence upon the history of Western art in particular, and has an enormous influence on the argument in my book. Aristotle talks about the human mimetic desire or the mimetic impulse, that impulse to imitate, as a very positive thing. This is the impulse that I see, for example, in my grandson who just turned 2 years old. I see him following his father around the house as his father is, say, putting a bookcase together. So he sees his father hammering, fitting pieces together. Well, my grandson, he wants to do the same thing. So he'll pick up anything and begin using it as a hammer. That comes naturally to human beings. You don't have to teach a human being to want, as it were, and I use this explosive word carefully, copy. You don't have to teach another human being to copy another, to imitate their actions. Aristotle says the reason why we do that is a very positive one. It's a way of learning. That's how my grandson is learning about the world, by imitating what he sees his father do. Now, there's always a point in the process of learning where one has to let go or ease up on the imitation. But at very least, when we begin to learn something, and I would argue even all through the process, we begin by imitation. It's connected with learning. It's ultimately connected with the height of learning, which is contemplation, says Aristotle. Now, where does Girard fit in all this? Well, I would say, look, we are fallen human creatures. We are broken human creatures who have this mimetic impulse. So it's not too surprising that we're going to use that mimetic impulse in ways that tend to things that are not good. So we're going to start, imitating what we see our neighbors doing simply because we see our neighbors doing it. So if we see them buy such and such a thing, we begin to want such and such a thing. And oftentimes we fall into that mimetic copying, or that keeping up with the Joneses, we might say. We fall into that unreflectively, and that can lead to all sorts of problems. But fundamentally, the mimetic impulse is a good thing. I think that's very much worth stressing.
And how about this idea of imitation when you're talking about learning? We imitate should we keep in mind that at a certain point we chart our own path, I guess, if you will? I'm thinking about maybe it was Picasso or somebody where it's like, I painted all my life to learn how to paint like a child. This idea of learning to a certain point and then maybe breaking the rules. Maybe you're moving away from imitation.
Yeah, Picasso also said when he began to draw, he drew or paint, he drew and painted just like Rembrandt. So
Yeah.
e- even Picasso begins with imitation.
Yeah.
And I would like to draw your audience to a wonderful book that I see right here on my bookshelf by a man named Scott Newstock. And the name of the book is How to Think Like Shakespeare. It's a wonderful book. There's a
Mm.
chapter in the book that's simply titled Imitation. And it's a wonderful account of how Shakespeare, who we think of rightly as the most original, the most creative uh, writer in the English language, um, we see him as someone who was constantly imitating other writers. And not just at the beginning of his career, but throughout his career. Most of Shakespeare's plots, for example, he quote unquote stole, right? There was no copyright in the Elizabethan period. So he would just take a plot. There was a successful play named, wait for it, Hamlet on stage in Elizabethan London before Shakespeare produced his own version of a very similar story. So he was constantly imitating, assimilating his sources. But your question is still valid because there comes a point in that process where an artist is going to want to push the tradition into a new area. The point of an artistic tradition is not simply to repeat, quote unquote, copy what has gone before. It is to learn from what has gone before and then to press the artistic inquiry into new directions. But I don't think ever in a way that divorces the artist from the tradition or jettisons the tradition. And
Mm.
we might ask whether an artist like Picasso found himself in that kind of position.
Yeah. To shift gears a little bit, I wanted to talk about maybe you'd say objective values and things like subjectivism and stuff like that. A previous guest I had on, Michael Ward, who some of the listeners may remember, After Humanity, a commentary on Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. And it's, I don't know, so fascinating to me. But this idea of art helping us to accept and understand objective values. Like, could you talk a little bit about that and connect the dots?
Sure. Another great question. So glad you mentioned Michael Ward because he is, in some way, the inspiration for my book, Beauty and Imitation.
Oh wow.
I read I read his book After Humanity one weekend when I was sick, and I devoured that book over the course of that weekend. Loved its arguments. It's a book about one of my favorite books of all time, C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man.
Great.
But I also admired the beauty of the book itself. It was one of Word on Fire Academic's first releases. Maybe it was its very first release, or maybe that was Holly Ordway's book. But I just thought, wow, I would love, I would love to publish a book, something like this with Word on Fire Academic, and that inspired me to send them a query, and here we are. So thank you to Michael Ward. There's more than one approach to art. My approach, as I said, is very Aristotelian. It's very Thomistic as well, drawing upon the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. And that means that it is fundamentally realist, or as we might say, objective in its orientation. So I understand the mimetic arts, again, film, dance, music, the novel, the short story, etc. I understand those arts as picturing reality. They are allowing to learn about, understand, and delight in reality in a more effective and a more joyful way than we might otherwise do. The mimetic arts freshen our perception of reality, all of reality, including the reality of our own psychological states, but also, and more importantly, the world beyond our head, and ultimately, um, the supernatural world as well. All of it is pictured in art. So, mimetic art's purpose, in short, is ultimately contemplative. It's meant to be a contemplation of the real, of the objectively real.
I know sometimes it can be difficult in terms of providing like practical strategies or steps and things like that. So I'm not necessarily asking from that perspective, but I am curious, like that thing of contemplative, contemplation for someone that's listening that is like, how do I do that? What does that look like? Is there anything that comes
Oh,
up, Daniel?
yeah. I often think about two pretty commonplace experiences when I try to answer a great question like yours. Just begin with a walk along the beach. Maybe it's just the perfect vacation day, a day in summer. You've spent the day on the beach and you're watching the sunset as across the horizon of the water. It's just lovely. You just want to stand there on the edge of the water, maybe with the water lapping around your ankles, and you simply want to soak the reality in. That's contemplation.
Hmm.
And that's not just a metaphor for contemplation. That's literally an example of
Yeah.
contemplation. You're contemplating in that instance the beauty of not a work of art, well, maybe a work of God's art, but you're contemplating the beauty of the natural world and you're soaking it in. So let's talk about what I mean by soaking it in. All of your, what philosophers like to call cognitive powers are in play here. Your senses, first and most obviously, you're looking at the sunset with your eyes. Probably your hearing is also in play because that lapping of the water is also delightful, just that repetitive rhythm of the water. Your sense of touch is in play as you feel the water lapping around your ankle. Smell is in play. So your senses are in play. Your emotions are in play. But I would argue, even in this example, your intellect and even your will are in play as you're contemplating the order of the natural world, um, the beauty of the natural world. That's a sense experience, but also an intellectual experience, also an emotional experience. All of those powers, those cognitive powers, are soaking up the real. And to change my metaphor a bit from soaking, we're chewing on it. We're turning it over in our mind, in our heart, in our body. That's what it means to contemplate.
Hmm.
We could get into artistic examples, but I think it's good to begin with an example of contemplation in the natural world.
Yeah, I love that. This is maybe a rather strange question, and I think I might have asked something similar to Michael Ward. The subjective experience of take the nature example, or whatever
Mm-hmm.
it may be. So say there is an objective beauty. There's such a thing as a Rembrandt. I'm imagining the prodigal son painting that many people have probably seen. Like there is this thing of someone could look at that and say, so what? Like, not, even though this objective, masterpiece, this beauty, and you could say the same thing in terms of nature. You look up at the sky and some can, oh my, wow, like the awe, the vastness of a beautiful sky. But yet, I don't know, there's something that I think is important about that, and I don't exactly know why in the way we think about this stuff and integrate it with our lives. Anything come up around that?
I think what you're noticing is the horrible fact that we can miss it.
Yeah.
The fact that something is stunningly beautiful in and of itself, objectively, does not mean that each and every human being is going to be arrested by it. And maybe it'll help to go to other experiences other than the beautiful to see the same phenomenon at work. So think of a good action, not a beautiful work of art, but a good action, a heroically virtuous action. Mother Teresa bathing a leper in the streets of Calcutta. That is stunningly good, but not each and every human being is going to be inspired by it. Some human beings are not going to have the formation, the moral formation required to see its goodness or to be very much impressed by its goodness. They're going to think, ugh, what a waste of a life. I don't want to touch a leper. Are you crazy? Right? Well, and the same thing can happen not just with the beautiful, the good, it can happen with the true. You can read, say, a philosophical argument, and it might be true, but the person may not get it. They may not understand it. It may not be any fault of their own. They may not simply have the intellectual formation to grasp that argument. We see that in the arts all the time. They can fail to compel, sometimes through no fault of their own. It can be the fault, quote unquote, perhaps, of the observer, just not having the formation, the education in beauty. Beauty is a kind of language. And if you don't know the language, you may not understand what is being communicated there. Um, it's not unusual to hear as a former high school English teacher. It's not unusual to hear teenagers say how much they hate Shakespeare. I try to take that very lightly because I know the problem is not Shakespeare's. It's my task to help form their taste so that they can see and appreciate what's objectively beautiful in
Mm.
Shakespeare.
Yeah. I love that example in the way of, with your students. And I'm thinking of another example that C.S. Lewis gives in The Abolition of Man, I believe, where it's not super fond of children, but he knows that he should be. The thing is like there's a difference between, you said something like, and we can miss it, but that they like a dash of or a soaking, to use that word, in humility can be like, but there's something here that I'm not seeing. There's something I'm not quite grasping in Shakespeare or in nature or in a beautiful piece of art. How do we bring humility along for the ride when we're, engaging in this?
Yeah, great question. I mean, yes, we do need docility, teachableness in every aspect of life. And what you're seeing in that passage from Lewis's The Abolition of Man is he's admitting a defect in himself, but he also seems docile. He seems to be open to learning how to appreciate what he calls the society of small children. They were just too
Mm.
loud and rambunctious for him. And sometimes that can be objectively tedious, but by and large, very small children, when they're loud and rambunctious, are delightful. And
Yeah.
he at least knew that he had to, in a way, mature in his appreciation. And I hope he did. But there are things that we all have to mature in our appreciation. And certainly when it comes to the arts, when I think of myself, um, I was in a situation analogous to Lewis when it came to Shakespeare when I was, say, 14 or 15. I didn't hate it. In fact, I kind of liked it, but I had very little idea of what was going on. But when our teacher showed us the film version of Romeo and Juliet, I was just taken by it happily. But there was still so much formation that I needed to do or to receive before I really knew what I was appreciating, or before I really knew what I was attracted to in Shakespeare. And that's the beauty of the love of art and the love of life, is kind of growing up to the thing that you're attracted to. It's much harder when there's no attraction from the get go, right?
Mm.
So you have the kid who says, "I hate Shakespeare. Don't take me to an art museum. Never play classical music. I can't stand it. No black and white films." So you get this resistance from the very beginning to at least certain kinds of art. Um, there you need a really good teacher who is, maybe, and I'm not necessarily thinking of a classroom teacher, but somebody who's going to introduce that person to the work of art. And that's an art in and of itself. And frankly, it may never happen. It may never happen. We may miss it in life, not only in regard to the arts, but in regard to lots of things.
Yeah.
So the virtue of docility, humility, are really important in every aspect of life, including the arts.
In modern culture, there's terms like the meaning crisis, the connection crisis, things like that. And a lot of times when people are in, at least in my subjective view, when people are talking about some of these things, they're not the first go-to is not the philosophy of art, this type of stuff that you write about. Why should it be when it comes to a meaning crisis or, connection crisis, some of these issues that we have, why should we turn to the way of beauty for wisdom?
Yeah, well, there's two things there we should distinguish. I think what's important for our social crisis, our cultural crisis, is not so much the philosophy of art in the formal sense, in the technical sense, in the sense that, of the arguments in my book. That's great if you want to partake of that. In fact, it's wonderful, I hope, if you want to partake of that. But it's not the first thing that's needed to address our cultural crisis. I think the first thing that's needed is art itself. Well, I wouldn't say it's the first thing that it's needed, but a big ingredient of what is needed are works of art, because it's works of art that bring people together in community, and perhaps especially create a certain sympathy between human beings. Um, we are more open to others, more docile to overcoming our differences, more humble, more open to objectivity and truth, the more we are soaking up the beauty and great works of art. Again, it's not a foolproof thing. Art doesn't work that way. We were just talking about that. But I think you have more of a chance of human beings meeting in their common humanity when those human beings are partaking of great works of art. the arts are always in their healthiest states in a healthy culture. Um,
Mhm.
they help make that culture healthy, and they themselves thrive when the culture is healthy.
How about some of the more challenging aspects of life as we start to wrap up here? Um, I know your previous book, the Good Death. Help me out with the full title of that, Daniel. But I'm
This
curious.
is
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, this is my novel, The Good Death of Kate Montclair.
When it comes to art, beauty, we think of death, suffering, the challenging aspects of life. What what can art teach us here? If that makes sense.
Makes a lot of sense, though. Again, I think it's helpful not to think in terms of art. It's too big a category.
Yeah.
Um, we need to talk about specific works of art, or at least specific tradition and practices of art, because the kind of art that we need is the art that is really going to lead us to wisdom, that is going to see human life as meaningful and good, that sees human life as having a comic resolution ultimately, at least capable of having a comic resolution as opposed to a tragic resolution. And not all works of art see the world in that way. So we need specific works of art. I would say we need works of art most of all in the mimetic tradition that I talk about, because again, those are the ones that are going to help us contemplate the reality of what is. That's very broad, but what I mean is the reality of what the human person is, the reality of what death really is, the reality of what family is, and friendship, and pain, and joy. All of those realities are brought home to us in a fresh way by great works of art, but of a specific kind. Picasso might not always feed us in that way. The Irish playwright Samuel Beckett, he's interesting, he's fascinating, but he's not going to feed our quest for meaning in just that way. We need specific works of art.
Nice. That's it's really helpful and also maybe challenging if you're not educated in these particular things of knowing, when is what. It's like the same thing. There's just so many beautiful books, but you may have a particular, need for wisdom or understanding in something, but it's not always easy to know where to turn.
Exactly. Yeah, well said.
Mm. So as we wind down the conversation, we wrap up with a pretty standard question that we ask most guests, time permitting, and that is, how do you define or think about wisdom in daily life? And I understand maybe we've been talking about that and around that for an hour now, but any sort of closing thoughts around wisdom in daily life for us, Daniel?
Yes, thanks for that question. That's fun to think about. I don't know if we have defined wisdom, but I like the a definition I take from Aquinas. That wisdom is about the first things. It's about first principles in every area of reality. So I'll give you one example where I see that thirst for first principles in play in my life. It's something I've been doing this summer. It began more or less spontaneously. I, as we said a moment ago, I write fiction. I also write drama, as well as write philosophy. And so I read a lot of handbooks or manuals or guides on the art of fiction, on the art of stage drama, even screenwriting. And I've devoured these sorts of books all my adult life. I have a whole shelf of them here in my home office. But what I started to do this summer is I started a document where I take the most helpful, the most useful snippets from these books, and I put them together in my own document. And I call it the catena aurea of the principles of dramatic writing. And that's a Latin phrase. Catena aurea means golden chain. And
Mm.
I'm stealing that from St. Thomas Aquinas because he wrote a book in his life that he called the Catena Aurea. And what it was snippets from the early church fathers commenting on the Gospels. And you can find this online. It's called the Catena Aurea. And so you can go to any passage in the Gospels and you can find in Thomas's golden chain various early church fathers commenting on that passage. So you can see what Augustine said about it, or St. John Chrysostom, or the Venerable Bede, or St. Jerome, or whoever. It's a greatest hits album of comments on that passage in scripture. So I'm playing with that, and I'm making a greatest hits album, a golden chain of snippets of the principles, the first principles of dramatic writing. And so that's one very practical way that I am involved in at my work desk every day, where I'm searching for wisdom. I'm searching for wisdom in the field of imaginative writing. I'm looking for the first principles. I'm looking for that which is first, the driving guidelines of the craft of writing fiction or stage drama or screen drama. So that's one maybe homey example. And of course, in my life overall, as a religious believer, as a Christian, a Catholic, I am seeking the first principle of all that is God, and ordering everything I do to that principle.
Beautiful. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much. Again, your book is Beauty and Imitation. I'm loving it. I highly recommend it. I'll leave a link in the show notes so it's easy to find. Daniel, thank you so much for coming on In Search of Wisdom.
Joshua, it's been a real pleasure being with you today. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the In Search of Wisdom podcast. I hope you found something useful for daily life. If so, I encourage you to put what you heard into practice. If you're interested in more tools for the art of living, consider subscribing to Perennial Meditations on Substack. By becoming a member, you'll help support the project and gain access to our podcasts, meditations, and courses. Until next time, be wise and be well.